Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's side event of the Reservistenverband, the Association of German Reservists. A special welcome to our guests who came across from the main conference at Hotel Bayerischer Hof. My name is Joachim Sanden, and I will introduce you to the side event. We would like to talk about a topic that has catched our attention. The topic is China as an epoch-defining challenge for us, about the importance of national reserve forces for the perseverance. In order to discuss this topic, we have invited a number of distinguished guests. Before we start, please allow a couple of administrative remarks. Similar to last year's event, this discussion will be recorded and streamed via YouTube. In addition, our photographer will take a couple of pictures that will be published in press articles and magazines like the association's regular magazine called Loyal. During the question and answer period at the end or to the end of the side event, if you may want to ask a question, please raise your hand and somebody with a microphone will come to your seat. So much for openers. And now I'd like to welcome our panelists. I will start with Professor Dr. Maybrit Stumbaum. She's a professor of security studies and strategic competition at the Marshall Center. Her particular area of focus is strategic competition with China. Prior to joining the Marshall Center, Professor Stumbaum worked as a team lead Asia Pacific at the Bundeswehr University, Munich, and led the EU's internal think tank on Asia. She has worked at renowned research institutions in Asia and Beijing and Taipei, including United States, Harvard, and Europe, including Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik. And she regularly works at the German MOD. She also serves as a reservist lieutenant or lieutenant colonel in the German Air Force. Professor Stumbaum, thank you very much for sharing your expert view on our topic. Thank you very much that you came at short notice to this event. Dr. Mikko Huatori is the executive director of the Mercator Institute for China Studies, MERITS. His research focuses on China's political and economic development, foreign policy, China-Europe relations, as well as global economic governance and competition. He has published on China's rise as a financial power, trade and investment relations with Europe, as well as on geopolitical shifts related to China's emergence as a global security actor. He studied in Freiburg, Nanjing, and Shanghai. In 2019, he was appointed as one of 15 German representatives to the German-Chinese Dialogue Forum. Dr. Huatori we feel privileged to have you here and that you will share the Merck's view on our topic. Thank you. We go on with an incumbent from UK, the Right Honourable Tobias Martin Elwood is a British Conservative Party politician who has been the Member of Parliament since 2005. He chaired the Defence Select Committee from 2020 to 2023 and was Minister of Defence for Veterans, Reserves and Personnel at the Ministry of Defence from 2017 to 2019. Prior to his political career, he served in the Royal Green Jackets. Later, it transferred to the Army Reserve and has gone to reach the rank of Lieutenant or Lieutenant Colonel. So, thank you very much indeed to join us tonight. I think the audience is very much interested in learning more on the UK view on our topic.
Thank you.
I also would like to welcome a member of the European Parliament and a former member of the Parliament of Baden-Württemberg, a former chairman of the German party Bündnis 90, Die Grünen, and a former chairman of the European Green Party. Since 2009, Mr. Reinhard Bütikofer is a member of the European Parliament and involved in a couple of associations, for instance, in a German-Chinese dialogue forum. He will give us the European view on our topic. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce tonight's host. It is the president of our association, Professor Dr. Patrick Sensburg. Ladies and gentlemen, you fulfilled already your task and gave a warm hand to the attendees and to the panelists. I just have to say, Patrick, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Joachim. Thank you very much for your introduction. Also from my side, a warm welcome to you here in the Literaturhaus on the Munich Security Conference and also on YouTube live, wherever you're watching this panel, the panel of the German Armed Forces Reservist Association. It's already a tradition on the Munich Security Conference. We had wonderful panels, and it's always said we're always a little bit in advance before things happen. And somebody said today, do you have a panel again for the next disaster? So the topic is China, as you found out, and China as an epoch-defining challenge for us, for the reserve and for the resilience, short version of the title. Title is stolen. You know it from the integrated review refresher from UK. There is one chapter about China. It's called China, an epoch challenging a situation with China. So I found in the refresher the title is so open for a discussion that we thought we'd take it as a title. So China really an epoch-defining challenge for us in Europe, for US, for NATO, for stability. And there are so many challenges on the economic side, on the security side, on the stability and balance of the world. So we said we make a first introduction round, 5 to 7 minutes, where each of you, dear panelists, can spotlight one thing that you have in mind on the situation China gave us, and then we go more into details. Of course, we will look at the situation, what happens with the reserve, what kind of situation and security issues do we have. But first of all, one little spotlight on your topics. And I would like to start with you, Mr. Huotari. I know you have clear positions, but the topic China is so big. What would you spotlight in the first 5 minutes you have?
All right, thank
Floor
you
is
so
yours.
much. Thank you for having me on this fantastic panel, and good evening. It's fantastic to see that the topic of China has entered, I think, a wider societal conversation, and I'm happy to contribute to that. I would like to make 3 points. The first, and I think it's appropriate for the role of our institute, that we say a few words about China and where it is actually heading, we see at the moment, and I would like to start with that. And just in headlines, really, China is currently in a political situation where we're looking at a system that is closing and entering into a period of more control, centralization of power. And that trend has been ongoing for quite a long time. It is built into the system, so it's not fundamentally new. It's not the current party and state chief, Xi Jinping, reinventing the system, but it's a pretty fundamental overhaul of institutions, of central leadership, and of the mechanisms of this political system. And they're all pointing into one direction, which is more party-state control. That's a trend that I think is essential for us to understand, because it means it's a system that is geared towards control, centralization, and not necessarily at all. Second key trend I think that we need to look at, we look at a fundamentally more slower China, a China that is not growing as tremendously as before. Why? And we had a conversation with Chinese counterparts at the Munich Security Conference yesterday about it, not because of external factors primarily, but because they have not managed to reform their system, their economic system, in ways that give them the capacity to grow faster for the next decade or 2 decades. And so I think it's key for us to understand we're not necessarily looking at a successful China internally. That's at least the way how the system, if they would be speaking frankly to each other, would define it. And that's something we also have to recognize, because we look at this miracle China growth story, lots of German, European companies being incredibly attracted by that size of the market, etc. But it's a system that is less successful than we think, at least from a macro perspective. We also look at a system where the society is confused about what's happening. It's tired. It is still shell-shocked from the pandemic. And there's deep uncertainty about the future of the next generation. Why? Because many are suffering from this current real estate crisis. That's where they've put all of their investment. They're suffering from the uncertainty in the private sector, which has generated all the jobs. And now we have record numbers for younger people who want to go back to the state sector. That's always a bad sign. I think we have to, again, recognize a system where we have deep uncertainty currently. Finally, if we look at how China behaves internationally, it's a period of recalibration, of trying to stabilize certain key relationships with the United States, with Europe. A swarm offensive, not necessarily a charm offensive, as it has been branded, being out there again. Wang Yi at the conference, I think, was not charming, but a little bit less, I think, in an assertive, aggressive mode compared to the previous year. So that makes a difference. But I think the fundamentals of China's foreign policy have not changed whatsoever. It is seeing itself in systemic competition with the West. It sees itself in deep, long-term structural security and hard military balance competition with the United States, which has an element of cyber and espionage contestation that is similar to the Cold War. It sees itself in a deep tech global conflict and contestation. So on foreign policy terms, it is a system that is geared towards building up the war chest for future conflicts to come. And that's basically the internal perspective. I want to make a point before I hand over to other colleagues to improve on what I've said. I think, and that's why it's so great to have this panel here, it's been long underestimated that China poses direct security challenges to the European Union, Germany in particular. And that recognition is only a feature of the, I think, past 3 to 5 years, certainly not among the panelists here. And it starts obviously with the fact that our closest security partner, the United States, is affected and in deep security competition with China. It's our regional partners, democratic partners, that fear China and work towards deterrence. It's the Taiwan crisis scenario, but obviously it's the way how China behaves vis-a-vis Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. But there's more to it. It's the cyber dimension. It's where we have constant cyber attacks on European companies. It's the issue of European unity and capacity to act, because one country is picked out, member states are responding to incentives, etc. And it's the issue of economic security, and that's the new debate, and I think it's where it hits Germany hardest, because the future of our entanglement with China in economic terms is not guaranteed. Why? Because China is out there to outcompete us. And that, I think, is essential for us to grasp, and in that sense, it's a fundamental, profound security challenge. It's a challenge to the European prosperity, our way of life, and our security and stability. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your powerful start. I have already a lot of questions in my mind, but wait. Mrs. Professor Sturmbaum, you already come from a panel where China was topic also. So what's your position, and what did they tell you when you came here?
Thank you so much. I think China was pretty much the elephant in the waters, because we spoke about the Indo-Pacific deployment 2024, which is for the first time seeing the German Navy and the German Air Force in the region at the same time. And it was pretty much about how the situation has changed on the ground, and that it's very different to the last deployment here. And this is pretty much thanks to what Mikko said, that basically we see not a different China, but much more progress in this form of control and centralization, of securitizing everything, at the same time of a phase of insecurity because of the economic challenges and the systemic competition. So there's much more spillover now in other areas. There's a much more aggressive foreign and security policy, but it's also a time for the CCP to basically fix strategic issues. And that's, as Mikko rightly said, is the issue of Taiwan. That is on the calendar, but it is also about being aware that this is about a challenge that is hybrid per se. It's a comprehensive challenge. So we have a kinetic challenge over there, but we have much more what some people call gray zone challenges, others call hybrid challenges, what we have over here in terms of disinformation campaign, in terms of cyber attacks. If you think about the island of Taiwan, they receive about 15,000 cyber attacks a second. So just to give you an idea about the magnitude. And this basically means what we really need here is more knowledge. I can tell you, I've been a reservist. I'm one of those, I was told yesterday, Neckermann reservists, right? I don't think that I actually had holidays. I think I've been working a lot. But the point really is because what we need is knowledge. So when I started about 10 years ago, I think I was pretty lonely with talking about the Indo-Pacific while being in uniform. And I'm sorry that I'm not in uniform today. It would be such a beautiful blue uniform, right? So, you know, we can't have it all, right? So, but the point is really that back then, there wasn't really an understanding that there's an interconnection of those challenges and that we need to care. So I remember when the Libya crisis and the Mali crisis all hit, my boss said to me, like, so what do you think about all this? And I said, I think we get disastrously distracted from what's really going on, because China's building up a new world order and we're just busy with crisis in our neighborhood. And today, we're still busy with crisis and wars even now in our neighborhood. And I think that is a challenge that comes back home, that we need to understand better how these wars and crises are interconnected, and that we are affected because they're interconnected, because cyber doesn't know any borders, because disinformation doesn't know any borders, and because as long as we don't fight per bullets, we fight by words. So narratives matter. And these are all the things that we have overlooked so far. So what I think, and the ones that I fully agree with Mikko about the challenges, but also that it's great to have this panel, because a couple of years ago, we were pretty alone, right, talking about this. And I can tell you, you have a great reputation as a party pooper when you say China is not just business and not just fantastic. But what we need today now is really to have the knowledge, and that came out of the panel. So we had there the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Lieutenant General Gerhardt, and the Chief of Staff of the Navy, Vice Admiral Kak, so two blue uniforms, but never mind, it's all good. And,
I understand this from now on.
And what they really say, like, we need more knowledge. We need to know about the countries that are there, what they're experiencing with this big elephant in the room, what their interests are, how we can work together, what are the partnerships. And I think this is the role for reservists, because the Bundeswehr is in no way in a position to build up that knowledge overnight. So there needs to be a way to have more strange little animals like me around to basically fill that space up. As you said, like, I worked in the MOD, I work normally in the political department on bilateral relations with East Asian countries. I've also worked for the last year at the University of the Armed Forces to build up their Indo-Pacific program in the Center for Intelligence and Strategic Studies. we need more people like this that come from the outside and share their knowledge. And I think here we still have a long way to go, because I can tell you I put 3 excellent sinologists forward to become reservists, and they all didn't really manage to understand all these acronyms that you need to know when you want to go into the reservist. And I think that is the challenge that we have. We really need to be able to bridge those worlds for the sake of our common interest, and also to cherish those bridge builders, and don't call them Neckermann reservists. You know, we work 2 jobs at the same time, and I think it's important that we have those worlds, because it's not only to translate the region to you, it's also to translate the civilian world and the military world to each other, and to explain to the civilian world that they are at risk, as Miko said about those attacks that are going on. When you talk, I was 2 days ago about an event about wirtschaftliches, right? So protection of our business. They're now coming to terms that basically China's programs about becoming world leaders in some areas might have an impact on them, might have an impact in terms of espionage, might have an impact in terms of on other gray zone activities. So I think this is the role that reservists can add to, can contribute to, in terms of like giving the information there, and secondly, bringing the information back to society, because what we need is a much more resilient society, because the hit's going to come, they're already coming. We need a way to come back on the feet and then to act again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your clear words. And I think a lot of reservists really understand what you were talking about, doing 2 jobs, being involved in 2 things, and have to do both good, because there's always a competition with the active soldiers, and you can't say, well, I'm doing it half good. So thank you very much for your clear words, and also the role of reservists in this situation. But nevertheless, now we come back to the army, to Lieutenant Colonel of the Army, if I understand right. So I think UK has changed a little bit the position in the integrated review. It was a little bit more chances, and then it's understood that it's challenging, and the challengings are a lot. So what's first of all, UK position now?
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be here. Just to explain the Royal Green Jackets, we were the first infantry regiment in our history to work out that if you wear green on the battlefield, it's a lot better than wearing red. It quickly caught on until everybody was doing it. And
as a green, can I quote you on that?
Yes. And better than red.
We ended up. So we're now the Rifles Regiment, one of the biggest infantry regiments still in the British Army, and I'm proud to be a reservist. I think knowledge is the word I'd take away from what you just said. Understanding what we're dealing with. You listen to some of the debates, and I'll be frank here, in British Parliament, and the level of grasp of what China is about is shocking. We've got some experts, there's no doubt about it, but a lot of people are just reading out some of the stuff that they pick up, and it's unhelpful, it really is. It doesn't appreciate where our country is going. It doesn't allow for a cognitive debate, which I think is what we're having here tonight. Bigger picture, a couple of years back, the book title for the Munich Security Conference was Westlessness. Do you remember that one? Today, it's lose-lose. Now, as a joke, this is a joke, what's it going to be in a couple of years' time? Is it going to be in Chinese, welcome to the Belt and Road? You know, is that where it's all going? Now, that's obviously rather dramatic, and it clearly isn't going to happen. But it does illustrate, even in a flippant way, the fact that our world is changing fast, that it is fragmenting, that it's becoming more polarized, more contested, and the assertiveness of authoritarian states are taking advantage of the West's timidity. So everything was going well up to the end of the Cold War, very clear-cut what we needed to do to defend our democracy, to stand up for the international order. And now we've become a bit complacent. And people have been aware of that they can push the boundaries as to what's acceptable. And worst case scenarios, we're seeing an axis develop. What sits behind Iran is Russia, what sits behind Russia is China. And that is a dilemma that we face. And it is China's century, there's no doubt about it. They are going to be the dominant force. And arguably there'll be a tipping point where they will challenge the United States economically, militarily, technologically in probably our lifetimes. How do we handle that? And that's glossing over what could happen internally, which I think was just touched on. They've got their own internal problems, which, from water supply, the middle class, banking, and so forth, the housing issues too. But the grip that President Xi has on his nation needs to be understood, and the direction of travel. This no limits relationship with Russia is worrying, because it's tilting Russia. Peter the Great wanted to look to the west. Very much Putin is looking to the east to sell oil and gas in return for that big brother support and where we're going. My worry is that we just don't understand China. Most people understand that Hong Kong once belonged to the British. They couldn't tell you how we got it in the first place. They wouldn't have a clue. They don't know about the century of humiliation, what Europeans did to China, the Boxer Rebellion, the Opium Wars. They don't understand it. The Chinese remember all this. The Chinese remember coming to, in both world wars, coming to support the Allies. But then they also remember that at the end of their own civil war, that place at the United Nations Security Council, the permanent representation, wasn't given to China mainland. It was given to the island of Taiwan, where the Kuomintang had moved to. Now, perhaps that's correct at the time, because they were recognized as the legitimate authority for China. But it took about another 3 decades before eventually the United Nations then granted that status of permanent membership on the United Nations Security Council to Beijing, back to Beijing. They remember all this. They absolutely do. We don't even understand it. And so what we're now seeing as they pursue an alternative interpretation of our rules-based order, they ran ahead with this, and we're just playing catch-up. We are entering another Cold War to some degree, because of the constant competition that we're going to see between the two superpowers, the United States and China. But the big difference between the last Cold War and this is China's Achilles heel, which is trade. They absolutely rely, to keep the middle classes, to keep China going, access to international trade. And that, for me, is the answer here. That, to me, is what should be exploited, is if we knuckle down on the standards and values that we impose, that we believe in ourselves, saying, welcome, join our club, be part of that prosperity, but under international standards and values. Don't drop our guard, because otherwise what's happening is the world is now splintering, and between the West and these authoritarian states, and many others, the Global South in particular, just watching to see which way goes. And this, of all places, the Munich Security Conference, is where we need to be coming out with the thoughts and ideas, not 1 or 2 chess moves ahead, as in what do we do about Ukraine and the Middle East, but exactly what is our long-term strategy to do with a fast-changing China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, from Britain was first, and then UK, then European Parliament. So, what, if we just remember what we heard, what is the position of the European Parliament? Do we have underestimated China? Have we overestimated China? Or haven't we just found a level playing field to act with China? You're so many years dealing with the issue China-Chinese relation. And what about the European Parliament? Has the Parliament found its level of talking with China?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me as a part of this conversation. Great pleasure. I would say, indeed, the European Parliament has found its own language in the China conversation. And fortunately, that has been a language that has been shared by the 5 major democratic groups in the European Parliament, ranging all the way from the conservatives, like the Polish conservatives, the EPP, the socialists, the liberals, and the Greens. Over the last 4 years, there has not been a single decision on China policy or resolution on China where these 5 political groups did not vote the same, did not share the views. That has given the European Parliament some voice on China policy, even though formally we are not supposed to interfere with the member states' privilege of shaping foreign policy. And I think we have been able to do that because we have indeed shared an analysis regarding the dimension of the China challenge. That does not necessarily also imply that we have found a way of talking to them. In fact, we have not been talking to China very much because in 2021, China endeavored to sanction 5 members of the European Parliament. They also sanctioned, by the way, MERICS at the same, on the same occasion. And of course, the European Parliament showed solidarity with those sanctioned colleagues. And the Chinese have, because of that, refrained from having an exchange with us. But before I try to describe the 5 dimensions that I would highlight regarding that Chinese challenge, I want to chew a little bit on the title of this event here, because I'm not sure we should talk about an epoch-defining challenge. That gives too much credit to China. As I read their ideology, as I read their propaganda, they try to convince the whole world that their rise is just inevitable, unstoppable. They have terms like the east wind defeats the west wind. We are experiencing changes not seen in 100 years, said Xi Jinping when he visited the other dictator in Moscow. The Chinese are trying to impress on everybody that this is now their epoch. And if we want to push back and to defend our interests and our values, I think we should not necessarily want to be the rabbit that stares at the rattlesnake. So I question the title. But having said that, I think indeed the challenge is huge. And I promise to just shortly identify 5 dimensions. Number 1, industry and technology. The president of the European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing said recently in a conversation that we had that if we don't push back actively against an incoming wave of highly subsidized Chinese exports, where China has overcapacities that sometimes are greater than the overall capacity that we have in Europe, there might be a danger of deindustrialization of Europe because we fall victim to their overwhelming economic and technological force. China is not pursuing an economic strategy that looks for long-term partnership. They haven't for quite a few years. In 2016, the Made in China 2025 strategy clearly set out a strategic goal, and that has been reiterated and strengthened recently by the leadership. China wants to be less dependent on international partners and wants to make the international partners dependent on China. And that is partly because China doesn't follow the same logic with regard to economy as us. For China, the economy is a tool for political goals. China has been coercive. Somebody listed the cases, and China has, in more than 50 cases, tried to use economic leverage to coerce other countries to do China's bidding. So there's a real challenge there. And to some degree, it's our own fault that they have been making so much headway because we were a bit complacent and arrogant. I recall a discussion within this China Dialogue Forum maybe 10 years ago where we discussed about innovation in China. And at the time, many people felt, well, the Chinese were the world's best copycats, but they didn't know anything about innovation. Think again, look again. Second challenge is that, as I understand their policy, they want to overturn the international order fundamentally. They're not just angling for a different variety of a rules-based order. What China pursues is the goal of substituting an international order based on international law with the age-old principle of the strong act as they will and the weak suffer as they must. That's a quote from the Peloponnesian War. I give you an example, Ukraine. Wang Yi, in his presentation today, said, we defend the national sovereignty of every country. And then he continued, and also the security interests of their neighbors should be taken into account. In the Ukrainian case, that means Russia's imperialist ambition vis-à-vis Ukraine has to be taken into account. And the Ukrainians, because they're the smaller country, have to give a rebate on their national security. That's not a version of an international order. That's the rule of the jungle. Third, I think China pursues a hegemonic ambition. There's a lot of language out there where they say China wants to be restored to its rightful place in the world. Statistically, up until 1750, roughly, China was the richest and the most powerful country in the world. Of course, we did not have globalization at the time. We did not have all-encompassing international relations. So for a farmer in Ireland or in Pennsylvania or in my home region, Palatinate, China didn't figure. But China now claims that they want to be, by 2049, roughly, the dominating number one. Fourth, China wants to establish a different guiding philosophy for governance thinking overall. The paradigm by which we have lived at least since the American War of Independence has been the paradigm of fighting for freedom. What China advocates is a philosophy of an unchecked state sovereignty, where the individual has to serve an absolute authority and has no fundamental right to challenge that authority. That is a principle of authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And finally, China is a big challenge also because it depends on China's action with whether we might have any chance of reining in runaway climate change. China alone is responsible for about a third of global CO2 emissions. Now, everybody says the industrialized world has to bear the burden because we were the ones that started emitting CO2 hundreds of years ago. Well, if you add up the figures, you come to the conclusion that over the last couple of decades, China emitted more CO2 than the UK plus Germany, plus France, plus Poland together. So clearly, it depends a lot on what China does, whether we can answer that epoch-defining challenge. That's why China is important, and that's why I believe it's impossible to take on that challenge if we don't work together, not just as the European Parliament or different political parties, but as democratic nations around the world.
Thank you very much for your first 5 minutes introduction. If we count these statements together, I would say, especially if I recognize your 5 points, there is a will, but the will is not the same than the ability to do something. When I come back to your points, Dr. Uotari, can China reach these targets? Have they got the capability? Have they got the possibility on a political field? Or do they have to reach these targets with military instruments? Because as I understood, in some ways we overestimate the possibilities of China. Not everything is working perfect. But if they have these targets, will they in the end, or will they have to use military power to reach them because they can't fall back behind their targets in their system? Do I understand this right? Is that the danger?
Big question, good question. First of all, I think we have to recognize, if we put ourselves into the shoes of Beijing leaders, they see the world as a relative gains game. It's one where it's not about absolute wins and everyone is better off, but if you lose, that's good for me. And in this relative gains world at this moment, it's also about our performance and whether our systems perform well. And they're looking at systems internationally, including ours, also in the United States, that not on all aspects of, I think, global leadership are performing particularly well. So for them, it's a window of opportunity. They've always defined this as a period of strategic opportunity, where now it's getting a bit more complicated, and but still, they have a chance from their perspective to just power through and make sure that even if their own system is not perfect, they can basically overtake us in terms of trade, technology, and also security matters. And then if you look at the hard facts, they have pockets of excellence where they have surpassed our own capabilities. And that's both in terms of technology development in certain military products, in terms of size. It makes a huge difference whether you have a relatively successful system that is basically just using the size as a multiplier of its own advances. I would also argue that it matters tremendously that the Chinese leadership is very much out there, as we discussed previously, and consider this as a systemic challenge. And we don't have that attitude. So for them, it's a comprehensive national power balance that they look at. We look at individual aspects of our relationship, and we might concede that maybe in economic terms we are still leading, but on other aspects we lose the game. And they take these issues together. What I don't believe in necessarily, which I think is implied in your question, that because of the domestic challenges, China will automatically turn that into adventurism in external policy. I think we don't know at this point. There's good reasons to assume that this is not the case, but we have to be risk averse in such a situation here that I think need to calculate with all possibilities. My current assessment would be there's a trend towards inward facing focus at this very moment, where I don't make that connection between a deep structural societal challenge that they're facing and as an adventure vis-a-vis Taiwan. That's not what I look at the moment.
Thank you very much. That's good to hear. Mr. Albert, you talked about history a little bit. If we look in the history of China, there is also a fear of being weak, because there have been times where China was such a huge country, was weak and nearly helpless, militarily helpless. Is that a motivation for having a strong military, or is it more like going on an expedition way, not just to Taiwan, to reach out. For example, in some eastern parts of Russia also, is there a military reach out of China, or is it just a last instrument possibility? How do you think?
Yeah, you touch on something that is so important, because the mindset of the Chinese is that they were very much the first superpower. I mean, bigger than Britain ever was in some degree. In the 1820s, they made a third of the world's stuff. They traded with that neck of the woods. They were the dominant force. But then what happened is, partly because of Europeans and other things like that, they became weaker and weaker and weaker, and then they were attacked by Japanese and so on. And they tried to do the right thing. Nobody came to their support. Indeed, what we did is we made China high. We sold them opium. We actually took advantage of their own weakness. So it's embedded in their culture now to be strong. And again, in their own internal history, as the creation of the Middle Kingdom, as it's called, you know, the actual Chinese, the Great Wall of China is a great example of that. Russia, to some degree, is the same as well. If you ever play the game Risk, you know, Russia's quite a hard bit of the board game to protect, isn't it? It's 11 time zones. And the Romanovs worked this out, as did Ivan the Terrible. If you keep attacking, then you actually are winning. It means if you just defend, you leave yourself vulnerable. And what we're seeing with China is also a strategy that they can leave doing today, what they can park it for another 5 years. We here work in electoral cycles. Actually, we probably work in news cycles, if you see most parliamentarians. China, it can wait. It can, you know, why bother invading Taiwan? It doesn't even need to bother doing with that. It can accumulate the military might, which it's doing. I mean, it's not been tested, but Army, Air Force, Navy arguably is actually bigger numbers-wise and kit-wise than the United States. Now, it's not as formidable in some degrees, but they're climbing up the ladder in that respect. So why bother? They want to be so big that you don't mess with them. That's what I think China is wanting to do. China has a strategy. They've long had a strategy of where they want to go. And they made that very, very clear. And we watch this from afar, and we've done nothing about it. And the longer we leave it, the more chance there is of some form of clash. Now, whether that's a miscalculation, misinterpretation that leads to conflict, or indeed it's done through proxy. But at the moment, there is a collision course between the United States and China in this century.
Thank you very much. To be able to defend their own country is rational. It's understandable. But isn't China going further? I remember, as I understood it, a clear statement from Xi that he said, until someday, if we can't take Taiwan on a political way, then we do it with military. Didn't he say that? Isn't there a clear perspective to use the military not just to defend the country? And concerning the history, it's quite understandable. You mentioned Japan. But hasn't he said, we will do it, we will invade, if it's not possible? Or did I understand it wrong? I don't know. Tell me.
No, I don't think you understood it wrong. And I think the important thing is that to keep in mind what a strategic position Taiwan has for the Communist Party. And I think that is important to keep those different parts of the puzzle together. What Mikko said at the beginning, right, about you have a party that goes further towards control, towards centralization, towards securitization. It's all basically a sign of a party that is built on a DNA of being besieged, on a DNA of being beleaguered, as you just pointed out, right? The kind of like you need to be the strong one. There's an interesting conversation that Heusgen, the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, recalled between Merkel and Xi. When Merkel said, like, listen, we made so good experiences with working with small countries, including all of them, you know, by that kind of like reaching out, not putting our strength first, and by that actually increasing our security. And she said, like, we made the different experience. Like, we reached out the hands, we were walked all over. And I think what we need to look at, and you see it here with one of the questions coming from YouTube, it's really about, you have a party, and I think it's really important to think about the party, not about the country. You have a party that has, at its core, it needs to keep its grip to power, and for that it needs to be safe. And it has, as you rightly said, right, the historical experiences of not being safe. So what you need to do is, like, you need to basically be able to control all of those who could probably harm you. And you can go to the whole concept of Tianxia, about where you have all under heaven, basically as a principle of China being safe in the middle. And that means why Taiwan is so important, because if you look at Taiwan, right, you have mainland China, you have Taiwan, you have the South China Sea, and you have Hainan, where all the submarines are based. So these are all shallow waters. So between Taiwan and mainland China, it's just about 70 meters deep. It's about 130 kilometers wide. So whatever submarine operation the PLA Navy would start, it's always visible for all of those other potential opponents, right? Because it's just shallow waters. You operate in shallow waters. Once you have Taiwan, you're right into the Pacific, right? You know, once you have Taiwan, you can basically launch any kind of attack without being seen before you probably resurface in front of San Francisco. That's for the US, it's another Pearl Harbor, right? This is a real strategic implication. It's not about history per se. It's really about being able to control your own affairs. So for the CCP, it's important to have autonomy and autarky in its affairs. And having Taiwan basically is the guarantee that you can project power if you need to, wherever you want. And this is why Taiwan is a completely different issue to all the others. I don't think that you will see Chinese troops acting militarily in any other theater of the world in the moment, for very good reason, because they're not tested. They don't really know if they can do the mission, right? They have a lot of the equipment, they don't really know if it works. Just look at the rocket force, you know, when they just removed the leadership, replaced it. Why? Because they found that so much corruption was raging through the rocket force. The rocket force is the lifeguard, right, in terms of any Taiwan attack. But they've seen that they put the fuel out there to do cooking, they put water in instead. So a lot of these things happened. All of this is important for the CCP to keep under control, to stay in power. So you need to have the strategic action for power protection. You won't test it anywhere else in the world, also not in the Red Sea, because you don't want to be seen as failing. Because that's also one of the lessons I learned. Think about the US and the Iraq war. The first time you could, Iraq second, not the first, but the second war in Iraq, the first time you could see that the giant of the US was failing. The giant of the US is not immortal. The same what happened to Western powers with decolonization after the Second World War. The colonial powers are not immortal. So China, with the Communist Party, pretty much has this in its gene, this mechanism of deception, right? But also this feeling of being besieged. And that comes together that you won't see them in other theaters. You will see more those of gray zone activities, but Taiwan is a different matter. And here, I think, really the challenge is perceptions. In the moment, from a Beijing point of view, you see China on the rise up there. You see the West in decline. You see the US in disarray, right? You see not Putin, sorry, Trump, the other guy. You see Trump.
They're good friends.
Yeah, it really sounds like, you know, it's a little bit like, you know, Putin, Trump, sorry, reading out a lot of interesting lines. But the point here really is like, this is a historical opportunity. You know, see it from a positive point of view. If you want to fix that strategic question, now is a really good time. Not if you have the West coming together. Not if Taiwan is able to put up its self-defense, which it isn't in the moment, right? Not if Australia and Japan and the US have actually increased the interoperability, which they haven't done at the moment, right? So it's a very good point in time. And last point on this, if you think about the next years, you have a new president in Taiwan with DPP, with Wang Yi, said today, like, we can't work with them, basically. You will have a new president in the United States. You have a lot of elections this year. You will have a lot of instability across the world this year. So the next year is going to be very interesting to see how this questions could be solved.
Thank you. Directly to this.
A very, very short. So I don't disagree with any of that. But when you speak to our fellow congressmen in DC, they're absolutely focus on Taiwan. They've got maps up in their offices. They're saying this is what we need to be prepared for, is for China to invade. And absolutely, China has this ambition, but it's sucked in as a vortex, all attention that this is what China does. And drawn out, if we're even talking about it now, and it's allowed China at the same time as deception to then advance its one belt, one road without people really understanding how so many countries have been ensnared in debt traps that they cannot afford because Taiwan dominates the headlines. Kenya is a great example. It's got a one belt, one road program, a massive train line being built there. The Chinese workers, and I bumped into them when I was out there, are being flown in on a one-way ticket. So they are doing, the hard graft work, and then they won't go home. So that's demographically changing the look of Kenya on the one side, and it was signed using Chinese law. That's how influential. Yet we didn't bother even looking at. This is a Commonwealth country that surely Britain should have, been helping and been concerned about as well. But because Taiwan dominates the headlines continually, we miss the details that's going along right across the world, mostly connected with One Belt, One Road.
Thank you. We're coming very soon to the question of the audience, to you, and to the ones who are online. We have already some questions, but I want to know, is it the same in Brussels? Do you have in your offices also the maps of Taiwan? Or how?
No. I'm convinced that the former Australian Prime Minister and presently the ambassador of his country to the United States, Kevin Rudd, is right with the title of a book that he published 1 or 2 years ago. And the title is The Avoidable War. But that certainly needs us to focus on how to avoid such a war. And that does not work without deterrence. Now, we don't have military assets in the Indo-Pacific, so our contribution to deterrence would have to be economic and political. As far as I can recollect, no European leader has yet spoken explicitly about deterrence vis-a-vis China with regard to Taiwan. But I think that's the challenge. And we have to look at other options. The Chinese toolbox is not very limited. They don't just have a hammer. They have screwdrivers and whatever. They could blockade. They could try to hamper Taiwan's economy. They use information manipulation. The Taiwanese call it cognitive warfare. They have so many tools to try to intervene. That's why we need to bolster Taiwan's democracy by supporting them, also their international presence.
Thank you. Directly, Professor Schumann.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to fully echo all of this, and I think the important thing is really that the real traditional kinetic war is really the least thing in there. It's really this whole approach that has all the other areas. As you said, with disinformation, cyber attacks, all of this, but particularly also the work done over here by the United Front Work Department, which basically pursues the interests of the Communist parties in our own countries, influences our discussions, our press coverage, but also some of the research that is done. Some of those, when you have people traveling to Xinjiang say, like, everything's good, like, we've seen it, it's perfect. So the point is really, in terms of coming back to resilience, that we need to understand that the challenge is bigger, as you said, right? It's not just like, sometimes when you read US reports, it's too much focus on the traditional military part and Taiwan. The challenge is really bigger, and it starts right over here.
One goes to Professor Stumbaum, and one goes to Rainer Bütikofer, and then we open the floor, of course, to the audience here. First question is, what is NATO's strategy in the Taiwan question? It's already touched several times. I would give this question to you, but it's open to everybody, of course. And maybe how are reservists included? You already touched this, that we need reservists in this issue even before we come into a military conflict.
The interesting thing about the Taiwan question is that, of course, if you look at Article 5 of NATO, Taiwan is below the line that actually covers the NATO area of operation. So that means that Taiwan is not really something to trigger Article 5, particularly because the US is also not directly the hosting countries there. Having said that, when you looked at the reconceptualization of the, it is softer versions of phrasing that, so we get all members on board, but it is one of the biggest challenge that you see there. And the interesting thing for NATO is that they're trying basically now to reach out with the AP4, the Asia-Pacific countries that are with NATO, so Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. They even wanted to have an office in Tokyo, then France shut down because France wants to be the only country that basically is operating there with the United Kingdom, because France has this benefit that is also part of the European Union. And the interesting thing is the NATO strategy in the Taiwan question is also, of course, the EU strategy, and I give this over to Rainer Bütikofer, because the EU solidarity clause is much tighter than Article 5 of NATO. So if the whole conflict there would enlarge beyond the Taiwan Strait, French territory would definitely be affected, and that would be interesting how the EU would react in such a case.
And that's why we go directly to Rainer Bütikofer for the second question. Then we have two questions here from the audience in the room. Second question from the internet is, why doesn't EU do more to stop EU companies from cooperating with the growing enemy China? I just quoted here. Are cheap products more important to us than our democracy and freedom?
The person who's asking that question may not have taken note of what the EU has really done over the last 7-8 years. In 2016, it was still a question whether we would recognize China as a market economy and whether we would come to the conclusion that we still needed an anti-dumping mechanism. In the meantime, the EU has created a whole series of trade defense instruments, anti-dumping against unfair foreign subsidies, the international procurement instrument that looks at the imbalance in the procurement markets, the investment screening instrument, the anti-coercion instrument. Quite some achievement, I would say. More recently, the EU has largely agreed on a new paradigm for our economic relations with China, and that was proposed by President von der Leyen, and it comes under the title of de-risking. And here I want to contradict one of the notions that are hidden in the question. I do not think that it would be a meaningful strategy to say, let's stop having trade or investment with China. Our overall economic philosophy and our own economic benefit. And frankly, if one country would try to do that, to decouple, as some people called that, they would very soon discover that effectively they would be self-isolating, because countries like Australia, Korea, Japan, or the ASEAN countries, they just can't completely decouple. So our philosophy is we allow trade and investment, but we oppose over-dependencies that would limit our ability to freely take our own decisions. So, for instance, with regard to rare earth, we're 98% dependent on China. 12 years ago, on some occasion, there was a conflict with Japan. China decided from today to tomorrow, we will not export any of these very important industrial raw materials. And the world was taken aback. That is something that we have to avoid. So the question is, how can we de-risk, which also is a huge challenge to some of the major corporations that have just simply put too many eggs into that one Chinese basket. Whereas some of the Mittelstand, the SME, have been much more cautious and circumspect in their relationship. So I would say No, cheap products are not more important than democracy and freedom, but that does not imply that we don't deal with them, that we don't trade with them.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. That's the control. That's going to be the flavor of conflict, is being able to deny us what we require. We had a discussion today about gunpowder, what you put in artillery shells and so on. There's not a lot of it in the world, and there's certainly not a lot of countries that make it. And we don't make it, a lot of it in Europe at all. That could be the limiting factor that prevents us from winning any future war, because we haven't got the shells, we haven't made enough of them.
Thank you. We have already 2 questions from the audience here. Our former Vice President for International Affairs. If everybody could introduce very quick.
Thank you very much. Does it work?
Yes.
Yeah. Good evening. Thank you. My name is Hans-Jürgen Schraud, and I'm with the German Reserve Association. I would like to pose my question to the panel, but specifically to my fellow Army Reserve colleague from the UK. When the strong man in Beijing right now looks at what happened to Vladimir Putin the last 2 years in Ukraine, what do you think, what does he see, and what does he learn militarily and politically when he looks at Putin, what happened to him with his adventure in Ukraine? Thank you.
I think you're right, that it's not just President Xi, it's any authoritarian state seeing the West's reaction to handling Russia. The fact that it's still going on, almost into its 3rd year. We've not put that fire out, and that shows that we are being tested. Our will, particularly the conversations with America, potentially putting funds as well. There's another aspect to this, which goes back to the China strategy. China enjoys Putin making all the noise, sucking in, again, the airtime of what's going on. Putin likes that. He likes the tension. China doesn't. So they're working as a sort of complementing approach here to Europe being distracted by what's going on in Ukraine, meaning that we're not focusing on what China is up to elsewhere. And we need to wake up. We need to really, really wake up to that. So I think from that perspective, we need to learn from this. This is why we need to be putting fires out. The threshold of the West's ability to deal with multiple conflicts arguably has already been crossed. And I would go further to say that the high tide mark of Western liberalism after the Second World War was when we departed Afghanistan, when we were no longer willing to see things through. That was the green light, not just firstly to Putin, but also to China. But they have very different approaches to what's going on, but a mutually agreed direction of travel, which is to see a weakened West.
The German Armed Forces Reservist Association is one of the best security journals. And we have 2 of the board here, and 2 journalists. And one next question comes from Mrs. Eckleder, from the security journal Loyal that we have.
Thank you, Mr. Sensburg, for this really nice introduction.
It's a wonderful journal.
My question goes to Germany's China strategy. Do you think it's a good strategy? Does it come up to the challenge? And how can de-risking really work out in reality? So if you are a Siemens, for example, what does de-risking mean for you as a company? Only 20% share of your activities should be in China and the rest somewhere else? Or what does de-risking really mean? Or should it mean in order to handle the challenge right?
Thank you very much. Who wants to take this question first? Rainer Bütikofer?
There's not a one-size-fits-all as regards de-risking. The automotive companies, the big OEMs, certainly face completely different challenges from even the automotive supply chain or from other sectors. And I think the task is now to identify adequate strategies for different types of industries and types of companies. But one thing I think is important. de-risking cannot just be put as a burden on the business. There is a government role, and I give you an example. I mentioned already rare earth. So far, almost everybody around the globe that does rare earth mining sells the stuff to the Chinese, they process it, they have a quasi-monopoly on processing, and then if you're behaving well, they will sell you some of the stuff. And you need it for everything, for all the modern production technologies. Now, de-risking would imply that we become less dependent on such a mechanism. For instance, Namibia has a lot of rare earth. They sell it to China. Why couldn't we team up with them, help them building a processing industry that would give them a leg up industrially, and we would gain access to a source that is not controlled by China? That is an element. In other sectors, we probably have to reshore some of the production with very basic constituent parts of, let's say, our pharmaceutical industry. We don't produce any penicillin around Europe at all. Maybe that is not wise. So I think we need a differentiated strategy. And as regards the China strategy, I would say that's using German school grades as the paradigm. I would say it's a good, a plus, a 2. But it depends, its value depends on implementation. And there, frankly speaking, the foreign ministry has different ideas than the chancellery.
Thank you very much. I think you have also a position to this question. If not, there's also another question waiting already for you. But first, I want to give you the chance to add to this, Dr. Huatari. And we have a question from the internet. I can read it for everybody first, and then you can maybe mingle both together. Talking about China and the Indo-Pacific, that's all far away. What's the West's interest in the region?
Let me start with this one, because I think it's just fundamentally, I don't share the premise of that question. It's not far away. I mean, we have 2 billion euros trade with China as Europeans on a daily basis. So it's the center of gravity of global growth. It's one of the most populous regions. So all of that immediately matters to us in quite fundamental ways. You have a huge share of global trade and our trade going through the South China Sea. You have the international order being at stake in the Taiwan crisis, in a possible Taiwan crisis. You have deep, close friends, partners in the region, such as Japan, South Korea, Australia, but also countries that we want to build out our relations in political terms. So I think it's absolutely clear, at least to most strategists and also leaders in Europe, that the region is actually our future in many ways. So in that sense, I don't agree with the premise of the question. In terms of de-risking, I think one of the first answers that you get from the German government, what we actually mean when we say it is we need to avoid companies, need to avoid cluster risks, and we need to support them in avoiding these cluster risks. That's one critical step, and we have to recognize the German government has done a few things to change the incentives for companies to get investment guarantees, etc. This is really tinkering at the margins. It does not decrease our exposure to developments in China yet at all. On the contrary, our exposure to China has grown. That's the reality we have to, I think, state factually. And it's not a tenable state of affairs, but I agree with Reinhard Bütikofer. It matters from company to company, and there's a role for governments to shape the trajectory. Diversification is part of that. We need to make sure that other partners become more important. But it's also clear that what underpins the debate about de-risking is we need to take Taiwan contingency planning scenarios very seriously, and we need to understand the trajectory of China to make our assessments about what's the right degree of exposure to such a more risky market moving forward.
Thank you you very much. I saw one last hand here in the audience. I think it was there, and then we come to our last issue, reserve, and finally. But first you.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Martin Simons. I'm with the Academic Association for Security Studies. And I wanted to touch on points that you have already talked about, which is, or sort of talked about, which is that it appears that the development programs and military interventions, especially in Africa, from the Western world, weren't successful in promoting liberal democracy and establishing constant partners in the region. On the other hand, China's influence economically and militarily, and to an extent Russia as well, has increased in those regions. And I wanted to ask you if you see any challenges arising from those trends, specifically in that region, and if you would have any policy changes that you would suggest in order to combat that development.
Thank you very much. I'll look on the panel who...
Yep.
Yes.
It's a really good question, and I think one that we don't want to answer. Afghanistan is probably the biggest example. Wandering into a country, owning the problem, and then not understanding the country and coming out with a Western boilerplate solution and wondering why it all went wrong. And we did the same in Somalia. We did the same in Libya. We've done the same in Yemen. We've done the same in other countries, Iraq, Syria, and so on. Wherever we wandered into, we've defeated the enemy, but we haven't enabled the local in a manner which understands what's happening in that country, so the indigenous capabilities and strengths. Setting up a parliament in Afghanistan, when they never really done democracy. I met the two MPs that represented Helmand province in Kabul, and I said, tell me, how's things down Helmand Way in Lashkar? Oh, we don't go there, it's too dangerous. So why bother even understand, the Treaty of Gandamak, the Battle of Kandahar, we should have remembered Britain should have remembered our history. It gained its independence from our country. And what we do is we wander into these places and then we leave before governance and security is probably strengthened enough that they can stand on their own 2 feet. That's what General Petraeus said. It's no longer enough just to defeat the enemy. You have to enable the local. And until we get that and understand that, but unfortunately it's now too late because we are so burnt by our experience. Sudan is a live example now, okay? Remember this when that comes up in the headlines next and this country falls apart completely and the problems there then spill out across the Sahel in Africa. We should be going in there now, providing support. That doesn't mean to say we own the country and charge in, absolutely not, but come out with cognitive methods of advancing basic support to get the country back off its knees. Otherwise, problems just spread. And worse than that, what funded, it continues to fund Russia, is actually the Wagner Group still kicking in Sudan, that's collecting all the gold from there, and that's keeping Russia going. That's the sort of thing that's happening because we've abandoned our interest, perhaps, in supporting governance and security. And it's falling into this whole narrative of we've entered a very complicated, fragmented, contested world.
Thank you. Reinhard Bütikofer.
China shares with many African countries and other countries in the so-called Global South the history of having been victim to colonialism. And for them, that's a valuable political capital. I recall having had a discussion with a representative of the African Union trying to point out how selfish China interferes in Africa. And at some point he started chuckling. And I was irritated and I stopped and he said, until the Chinese will have done to us as much as you have, Europeans, they can exploit us a couple of decades. So I think we have to understand that. And China helped some of the countries, some of the liberation movements when Europe still held on to external control. That's also part of history. Now, China has used that political capital for gaining influence and domination. And China is developing practices that annoy these countries. And there have been signals that these countries are not necessarily happy with how China deals with them. That used to be this narrative that our development cooperation is hampered because we have so many strings attached, and China just gives the money. So why wouldn't they win? The reality is that in their development cooperation, there are more strings attached. We give grants, they give loans, and they include very restrictive conditionalities. And that is now being more understood. But still, if China's cooperation is the only game in town, European criticism doesn't move the needle. I recall one conversation with the finance minister of a developing country who was asked what she thought about Belt and Road, and her answer was, give me an alternative and I'll tell you what I think about it. And now we're beginning to invest through the so-called Global Gateway Initiative of the European Union. We're beginning to invest in such strategic development projects together, and maybe making better offers to the Chinese will tilt the balance more in our favor.
We come to our final topic. Reserve, of course. Understanding that China has built up a huge military competency, but not necessarily will use it. As we heard, they haven't tried, and if there are other ways, why not using other possibilities, but having the possibility. But China is already in cyber and so many fields involved. There are things happening. So don't we even, is there not a huge need of experts, of reservists, already now having China inside and preparing and having the chance by being prepared, not building up a situation when it slides into a war, securing the world order? Don't we have the chance to avoid it still when we were more prepared, when we got more competency also on the military side? And for this, we need reservists, I think. Am I right? You played the ball already in that field.
Well, I can only say yes. Of course, when I started being a reservist, it was funny actually, because initially I was asked into the reserves really as an expert, right? Because the expertise was missing, and initially I was asked as an intercultural advisor, and I said, like, why should I go to Afghanistan? I know nothing about this, right? You know, just because a country is far away doesn't mean that I'm competent in it, right? So we've come a long way since back then, and I still remember my nice day with my MAD encounter when he says to me, but Mom, why are you in touch with all those Chinese? It's my job. I talk to people. That's what I do as a profession. What I mean by that is, like, we need those people, right? Militaries cannot go reach out, get this expertise. So we do need this expertise, particularly because we need it fast. When you look at the Americans, you have the foreign area officers, people who are excellent in the country. They speak the language. They know everything about the country. They're really, really good. We have this also in other countries. In Germany, we don't. We just don't. We don't have specialized experts. I know one, I think he's also Air Force, I'm sorry, officer, like a active duty, who has made himself an expert in East Asia, learned Chinese and others, but he made this out of his own will. It did not help his career immensely. So the challenge really is, like, where do we get the knowledge? Where do we get it quick? Where do we get it available in those specifications, as you said, because it's not only about knowing about China, but it is, of course, knowing about cyber attacks, knowing about all the other areas. The challenge we really have is, like, how do we get them in? And I just would like to recall what I said at the beginning. I've tried several times to get, like, highly qualified, highly motivated people to get into the reserve. And it's been just difficult for them to enter. Like, I've been there for more than 10 years. It's difficult still for me every time I enter. I remember when I was at my Reservestabslehrgang in Hamburg, right? You know, if you want to become a colonel one day, you need to go to that course. And, you know, I've been work in the ministry for all those 10 years before, but there I learned how to do this, which is really funny. But the point was like, we were 50 people out of like middle management, higher management, up to CEO positions. And we got lectures on stuff that we thought, like, seriously, you know how much money you burn this hour? Right? I had a person talking about recruitment to us, like it was a web presentation with this little face up there, and he had basically made this plan of how you become a commander for a normal active duty officer, and he had just crossed out those positions we can't get, right? General, I can't become a general. Literally, he said to us, like, you know, the best thing is like if you get like as broad as possible in your portfolio, which makes sense for an active duty, not for people like me. I will never command anybody. And I'm not a Neckermann reservist, but I also will never command anybody because that's not what I've been called in for. I've been called in for analysis, for expertise. And that's what I mean. You have 50 people, you pay a lot of money because you pay their salaries in this 2 weeks, and you give them a presentation on how they can advance that isn't fit, that isn't tailor-made to them. And that's the challenge we have. We have no time to lose in the moment, no time to waste. We do need the knowledge, we do need the expertise, we do need to get more people in there. There aren't many people out there anyway, and we still make it difficult. So I think that's a challenge we face, just very internally.
And the good thing is, we have lots of people who want to do their service, who want to find a placement, bring their wisdom, their knowledge inside the system, because they know it's a time where we need it. It's the same in UK, I think. But the system is not prepared for it and sees problems and not chances.
And the interesting thing, just to add to this, is this has really changed, right? I remember when I started wearing a uniform, people were always like getting off the uniform before they left the ministry. Because they were, I remember once I had to take some photos for I don't even get the word at the moment, my badge, right? And they took me into a car with a driver so I didn't have to face the public out there. Because they were so concerned in Berlin, right, that I would probably, you know, Kaserne is not in the nicest area. You probably, sometimes, you probably would have some difficulties. That has changed, completely changed. Like, there is an interest in joining the reserve force, in supporting really the interest of the country.
And I hope everybody here has interest in the reserve, because we want to invite you after this panel for a little reception. A few drinks, I think, are there. And so we can get into contact and discuss this topic with each other, with you. I think everybody will stay a little while to discuss things with you. I have to say thank you to the panelists. It was a wonderful panel. Great, thank you that you were here. And we have some little gifts for you, of course. First an applause, I think. 1932.
Ja. 19 Uhr am Sicherheitskonferenz.
Last year, we had the Invictus Games in Germany, in Düsseldorf. Of course, you get a coin from our Reserve Association, no doubt. But you also got the official booklet, Gesichter des Lebens, Faces of Life, of the participants of the Invictus Games. It was really a wonderful, enormous and special time with the Invictus Games. We were all impressed, touched, and there are so many wonderful pictures in this booklet that gives an impression what people who served, of their characters and how they involved in these games. Thank you very much that you have been on the panel, and this is a little gift, a booklet of the Invictus Games. You got the first one?
Perfect, thank you.
Pleasure. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you much appreciated.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Yep.
Come directly here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You're the first member of the European Parliament who got the book. Not even Michael Gahler got it. It's really
Right, great to see you. Thank you.
Ganz herzlichen Dank wieder. War wieder eine Riesenfreude. Dankeschön. Dankeschön. Okay, you're all invited, everybody, and I think we all stay here for a little discussions in between. Thank you that we were here. See you next year, and hope all our problems that we defined here didn't get worse. Thank you very much.
Thank you.